here in this room, hundreds of volunteers rushing to get supplies together and send them to those who are fighting against Russia. So they've got foodstuffs here, medical supplies, hundreds of volunteers rushing to get supplies together and send them to those who are fighting against Russia. So they've got foodstuffs here to join the volunteers, and hundreds of volunteers rushing to get supplies.
From the border, a multiple rocket launcher with its designator searching for Ukrainian positions. We return to film it. 200 meters away, Yuri is trying to ignore the war.
Скажите, как обстановка сейчас?
Нормальная обстановка, как всегда.
Не знаю, военных много.
Что-то я их не замечаю.
But it's hard not to notice the constant stream of convoys to the border. Tanks, Grad missiles, many painted with the mysterious Z. In these areas less than 15 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border, war has taken the inhabitants by surprise in the middle of the night, right after the announcement from Vladimir Putin.
Мне сестра позвонила в 5:30, говорит, Путин объявил, что будет война с Украиной. Вот. И через полчаса это все началось. Страшно было, очень страшно.
Residents were woken by the sound of helicopters and bombings. They were not told that an offensive was coming. This woman asked to remain anonymous.
Мы ждали объяснений вообще-то каких-то. Или чтобы сказали, что тогда действительно, или там не бойтесь, будем стрелять, или там не будем стрелять, или ну хоть что-то, мы же вообще в неведении как бы.
Vladimir Putin has always denied invading eastern Ukraine since the start of the conflict in 2014. He also claimed that the buildup of troops along all accessible borders with Ukraine this year were simply military exercises, right up to the moment of invasion.
Well, the Ukrainian war effort is very much present, even in areas so far untouched by the fighting. France 24's Gulliver Cragg reports.
There's not fighting where we are. We came here from Kyiv in order to be at a safer place. This is a 3 hours drive approximately from Kyiv in normal time. It took a lot longer yesterday because of everybody fleeing the capital. But actually, we found that the war really can be felt here. There are checkpoints being set up everywhere. People, local authority workers are taking down the road signs because they want to the Russians to have as little chance as possible of knowing where they are if their satellite navigation doesn't work. And of course, we have seen men going to sign up for the territorial defense brigades in villages. The local mayor, for example, of one village told us that all the young men already have gone to the front. There is total mobilization for the armed forces in Ukraine. And there's also a huge amount of mobilization, very much to be seen everywhere around here in terms of people volunteering to help the army however they can, or to help displaced persons who've fled their homes, whether it's the capital or places further to the east. So there's a real sense that we are in wartime here, even in this region in central Ukraine, which people didn't think would be likely to be so directly affected by the Russian offensive, or at least not so quickly. But in fact, as early as Thursday morning, a military base around 20 kilometers from where I am now was shelled and 2 soldiers died. So even people in the towns around here don't feel entirely secure. There have been air raid sirens going off in towns, even in this region.
Well, we can now bring in our guest tonight. Javed Ali is an associate professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at Michigan University. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. I want to start by asking you, the US intelligence community predicted that Russia's invasion of Ukraine would happen. So why were so many people still so surprised when it did?
Thank you for having me this evening, and that's an excellent question. And even armed with the best intelligence sometimes, that still does not provide a 100% accurate picture of what may happen, certainly in a situation like this. So I think that, at least from the U.S. intelligence perspective, based on the statements that the White House was making in the days and weeks leading up to the invasion from Wednesday night, that all of those insights appear to be correct. But once the campaign started, that's when things can get very fluid and chaotic. And I believe we're still in that moment now where the situation on the ground is still unfolding. But every day that goes by, there are consequences for all sides involved. And the intelligence picture will still be forming in these dynamic moments.
Do you think it's a fair assessment to say that the US and maybe the West in general has underestimated Vladimir Putin?
That may be a fair criticism, but at the same time, sort of turning it around, one could argue that President Putin and the Russian forces are also meeting resistance that perhaps they did not assume would be the case. And whether the pace of the campaign, the Russian campaign as it's unfolding now, is this going according to the plan? I suspect that it is not. And they are taking losses every day, not only on the battlefield in Ukraine, but economically they are suffering, or there are economic measures and sanctions being put in place. Certainly international outrage. There also seems to be growing domestic internal dissent within Russia. So every day that goes by where Russia doesn't achieve its military objectives in Ukraine, the costs just grow greater for Russia. And it will be interesting to see how this unfolds and how that adjusts President Putin's strategy going forward.
And speaking of President Putin's strategy, what do you think his end game really is? Because at this point, it does feel as though he doesn't really care what the international community thinks of him, nor of the sanctions they're imposing on him.
And that's another great question. Trying to discern what President Putin's ultimate objectives are, it's a very difficult sort of process for the intelligence community and policymakers to understand. But even if President Putin's initial strategy was to encircle Ukraine, put pressure on the government in Kyiv and the West by not invading, well, he's moved on to another aspect of whatever that strategy is now by invading. And I would argue that by invading, he has lost a lot of leverage that he had previously. And now, again, Russia is bearing the consequences of these decisions, not only physically with the losses to the troops and the equipment, but all the other things that are happening to Russia. And did President Putin anticipate this? Is he willing to absorb these costs? Is he going to further escalate? Because I don't believe that all of Russia's military capabilities and cyber operations capabilities have been used. And if so, that will only, one would think, trigger an even more aggressive reaction from the United States and the West. So this is going to be a dynamic that's going to play out back and forth.
Now, you've compared Russia's invasion of Ukraine to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan back in 1979 into the 80s. What are the parallels you see there, and what lessons could be learned from that?
So the parallels are, now this is a different time frame. We're only in the initial days of this conflict in Ukraine, and the conflict in Afghanistan for the Soviet Union lasted almost a decade. But Russia also mobilized its military, went into a foreign country without invitation, thought it would quickly achieve its military objectives, and then got bogged down in this brutal campaign where the Afghan society and country suffered the most, and hopefully that doesn't happen in Ukraine. But Russia also lost thousands of troops, had to change its military tactics because of the use of certain weapon systems against Russian helicopters and tanks. And a lot of historians would argue that the Afghan war broke the Soviet Union militarily, economically, even spiritually. So these are all long-term things that President Putin has to think about. How long is he willing to push Russian troops into Ukraine? And the deeper they go, again, the more risk that will entail, and the economic consequences of that too. We don't know if Russia will stay for years, but if they do, the potential for an Afghanistan-like quagmire is certainly high.
Okay, Javed Ali, thank you very much for your time here on France 24. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, there were more protests in Russia and more arrests as well as further anti-war demonstrations broke out in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. According to one monitoring group, over 3,000 demonstrators have been arrested since Thursday. Well, for more, I spoke to France 24's Nick Holdsworth earlier.
There is a war apparently launched by Putin. This is Putin's war, on the pretext of Nazis in Ukraine, drug users in Ukraine. It's just so surreal. The lies are so intense, and Russian media can't even use the word war, assault, or invasion in any of their reports. They've been forbidden from doing that. There's talk of, there've already been restrictions on Facebook and Twitter. There's talk of them being banned outright because Putin is terrified that the Russian public will understand that this war is insane. I think they do, but not in sufficient numbers yet. I was talking to a German chap I bumped into who works at a school here in Moscow, and we were discussing the situation. I noted the fact that historically 3% of a country's population is enough out on the streets to make change. 1789 in Paris, 1848 in cities across Europe, for example, going way back. Well, in Russia, 140 million population, 3% is 5 million. The last time we even had 1 million people on the streets here was the winter of 2010, 2011, the White Ribbon protests. If those young people protests start to grow and 5 million Russians stand up and say, we stand up and be counted, we are not for Putin's war, something may change. But until that, I'm very sad to say that it doesn't look good. And the Russian military is not happy with what's going on, and the lies continue about how the Ukrainians are arming their people purposely to hide behind them, use them as human shields. The Russians don't want to hurt civilians, but they might have to soon. There are reports that the Chechen leader, these have been confirmed now, Ramzan Kadyrov, has sent the North Brigade into Ukraine. These are 10,000 battle-hardened Islamic extremists who won't have any compunction about shooting men, women or children whom they will see as infidels. This is really a very serious moment, and yet here in Moscow today on a fairly fine but crisp spring day, it feels totally surreal.
Well, refugees fleeing Russia's invasion of Ukraine headed west on the third day of fighting. About 100,000 people have crossed into Poland from Ukraine since Thursday. The Polish government has reserved 70,000 hospital beds for the war wounded and are preparing a train to transport the injured from Ukraine. The UN Refugee Agency expects up to 4 million Ukrainians could flee if the situation deteriorates further. Well, like many other countries in Eastern Europe, Hungary has extended legal protection to Ukrainians running from the fighting. It's letting Ukrainians in at all 5 land crossings across the 137-kilometre border between the two countries. Often considered an ally of Vladimir Putin, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has pledged his support for all EU sanctions against Russia. He also appears to have reversed his anti-migrant stance, welcoming all Ukrainians into his country. Take a listen.
We're letting everyone in. I've seen people without travel documents, but we're providing them with some. And we're also allowing in those who've arrived from other countries.
Now, EU foreign ministers will meet this Sunday at 6 p.m. Paris time to discuss imposing a third package of sanctions on Russia and an emergency aid package for the Ukrainian armed forces. Member states are also close to deploying what's been called the nuclear option of possible sanctions. After its initial reluctance, Germany is now on board with excluding Russia from the SWIFT international payment system. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has hailed the step, saying this would result in, quote, billions of losses for Russia, a tangible price for this vile invasion. Meanwhile, Ukraine has denied Russia's suggestions that it was refusing to negotiate a ceasefire. It said Russia had attached unacceptable conditions to potential talks. Sinead McCausland has more.
As Russia continues their advancement on Kyiv, Moscow says Ukraine refused to negotiate a ceasefire, which Ukrainian authorities deny.
Seeing that the Ukrainian side essentially refused the talks, the advance of the main Russia contingent resumed Saturday afternoon.
Still in the capital, President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading with world leaders to take diplomatic actions against Moscow, particularly to block Russia from banking network SWIFT. Hungary, France and Italy have all suggested they support the ban.
And Hungary made clear that we support all the sanctions, so we will block nothing. So what the prime ministers of European Union are able to agree, we accept it and we support it. This is time to be united, so it's a war.
But some countries like Germany are more hesitant, facing harsh words from their European neighbours.
Germany cannot immerse in concreted selfishness, egoism. You have to stop this. We have to stop this. We have to stop Putin.
Turkey is also seen as an ally, Zelensky prematurely thanking the Turkish president for blocking Russia from the Black Sea, which Turkey has not yet confirmed.
I thanked our friend Erdogan for his unfailing support of our independence and territorial integrity, and agreed with him that today it's extremely important to ban the passage of Russian warships to the Black Sea. That's done.
As a refugee crisis looms, with the UN Refugee Agency estimating at least 150,000 Ukrainians fleeing their country,
то при участии Запада, делались попытки свержения Кучмы, отстранения его от власти, начиная с 2000 года. Потому что акция «Украина без Кучмы», которая была начата после убийства журналиста Гангадзе, все мы знаем эту ситуацию, она, конечно, активно поддерживалась Западом.
Я расследовал и дело Кучмы тоже. И я лично подписал постановление о возбуждении уголовного дела против Кучмы. Я считал и считаю, что Кучму есть за что привлекать уголовную ответственность. Действия Кучмы в любом случае связаны с этим убийством. А то, что потом дело Гангадзе было использовано против Кучмы, так это и есть как раз отражение внутренней и внешней политики государства того этапа.
September 2002, Special Representative of the U.S. Department of State, specialist in Russia, Marie Yovanovitch raised the issue of Ukraine's violation of sanctions against Iraq in connection with the alleged sale of a batch of Kolchuga radar systems. Representative of the President of Ukraine, Viktor Medvedchuk, thoroughly investigated all the charges and presented irrefutable evidence that the Kolchugas were not supplied to Iraq. A little later, after the occupation of Iraq by multinational forces, the United States did not find any traces of the Kolchugas. The charge was as valid as Colin Powell's test tubes of anthrax. But Kuchma did not feel any calmer because of this. Marie Yovanovitch took over as charge d'affaires of Ukraine. Soon, her name would be closely associated with color revolutions. In the meantime, it was necessary to decide who would be president after Kuchma.
К декабрю 2000 года, то есть в 2001 году, Кучма фактически потерял свой авторитет, свой рейтинг. Им уже было очень тяжело работать. Очень тяжело.
And a candidate was quickly found. Former Prime Minister Viktor Yushchenko. He was a 100% pro-Western politician. He had an American wife and was loosely affiliated with the U.S. Department of State.
I was asked to give some speeches in Ukraine. And when I went there, I got a long briefing by John McCain of the State Department and Colin Powell about who you could trust and who you couldn't trust. And there really was just one person you could trust. And that was Viktor Yushchenko, who was running for president. The briefing I got was, if he doesn't win, Ukraine has no chance. The State Department.
Viktor Yushchenko, born February 23, 1954. He has a degree in economics. From 1976, he was involved in the banking sector, working his way up from a clerk to chairman of the National Bank of Ukraine. However, in this post, he did not decide anything himself. In 1999, he became Prime Minister of the government of Ukraine. In 1993, by a twist of fate, on a plane from the United States, he sat next to a United States citizen, Catherine Claire Chumachenko. They were soon married. Catherine Claire Chumachenko. She was born in 1961 in the United States. From the age of 14, she was a member of the ultranationalist Union of Ukrainian Youth. She worked as director of the Ukrainian National Information Service of the Washington Bureau of the Ukrainian Committee of the American Congress, and also as an assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. And she worked in the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Congress. The U.S. attention to the upcoming presidential elections was side by side with direct pressure on the Ukrainian establishment. Major forces were engaged in the struggle, including George Soros.
Очень долгий промежуток времени, начиная с 2000-х годов, структуры Сороса совместно с разными институтами выстраивали вот эту сеть мягкого влияния. Они подкармливали молодежь разными грантами, разными общественными мероприятиями, поездками, обменами.
Ющенко стал дестабилизатором политической ситуации в Украине. Были противники политических конкурентов, но не были врагами. А вот после вот этих событий, которые прошли после дела Гангаза, конец 2000 года, 2001 год, да, это было очень тяжелые времена, очень тяжелые именно в политическом плане. А отсюда страдала экономика, социальные вопросы и все остальное.
In May 2004, the Verkhovna Rada published a report that revealed financial interference by Western countries in the internal politics of Ukraine. In July 2004, the U.S. House of Representatives adopted Resolution number 336, which gave a negative assessment to the political situation in Ukraine. Usually, this means a burn notice on the opposite side. In September 2004, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution ordering the executive branch to impose sanctions on Ukraine in case of violations during the presidential campaign. Basically, the Ukrainian president had already been selected in the United States. There was little left to do. Simply force Ukraine to bend to the will of the United States. When